Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today at the WSSA webinar series. We're going to give a few minutes for the room to populate, and we will introduce Dr. Stanley Culpepper, President of WSSA. Thanks everybody for joining us. We'll get started in just a few seconds. Thanks everybody for joining us. Dr. Culpepper, would you like to get us started?
Thank you so much, Eric. Welcome everyone. Welcome to the continuation of our WSSA USDA-ARS seminar series. My name is Stanley Culpepper. I am the current president of the Weed Science Society of America. It is my honor, number one, to have all of you joining us, and number two, to introduce Dr. Steve Young. Steve is a weed scientist and the national program leader for weeds and invasive pests at ARS. Prior to his current position, he was a faculty member at the University of Nebraska, Cornell University, and most recently, Utah State University. Steve, take it away.
Thank you, Stanley. Appreciate the introduction and appreciate the WSSA co-hosting this with USDA-ARS. So I think for most of you, you've maybe heard about the series, and we're in our second week. Last week, we started off with an introduction and talked about the historical kind of where ARS has been, where ARS weed science is going. If you get a chance and you haven't seen that, feel free to go to our website to view that recorded presentation. But today we're going to get right into it. Talk about integrated weed management and cropping systems, and we're going to hear from Dr. Marty Williams, who's a weed ecologist or ecologist with the U.S. Department of Agriculture (ARS) and an adjunct professor with the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. So he's a lead scientist with USDA-ARS's Global Change and Photosynthesis Research Unit in Urbana, Illinois. Dr. Williams leads the unit's weed science thrust in addressing critical obstacles in cropping systems by conducting research to define principles and develop improved practices for crop production, including research on climate change, issues related to herbicide use, and multiple tactic weed management systems. He's recognized for delivering solutions to vegetable seed and food processing industries in the U.S. and beyond. Dr. Williams provides leadership to the Weed Science Society of America through various committees and serves as associate editor of Weed Science. He's been elected to the executive board of the International Sweet Corn Development Association multiple times, serving as program chair and president. Prior to joining USDA-ARS in 2003, Dr. Williams grew up on a livestock and grain farm in Missouri and obtained his PhD in the Department of Agronomy and Horticulture at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. So welcome, Marty, to the webinar today. Look forward to hearing what you're going to tell us. And just for a reminder for you guys that are joining, there will be a Q&A at the end. So save your questions, use the chat, whatever you feel comfortable, and we'll address those. So Marty, take it away.
All right, Steve, thanks for the intro. And I'm sure I'm not alone when I share that I wish we were in person, especially in Vancouver. That's a beautiful place. My running shoes in Stanley Park had big plans for last February, but we'll put that off to another time. In the meantime, this is great that we're at least able to do this virtually. And thanks again for the nice introduction, Steve. So for the sake of thoroughness, please allow me to define integrated weed management. As defined by the Getting Rid of Weeds website, more affectionately known as GROW, integrated weed management is an approach to managing weeds using multiple control tactics to provide the best chance to control troublesome weeds. The idea here is to reduce reliance on a single tactic that a weed population might develop resistance to. So it overall favors more complexity over simplicity in how they're managed. In the long term, it's aimed at providing an advantage to the crop over the weed, and also for long-term success, both environmentally sound and economically sustainable. So the figure on the left shows how integrated weed management is this intersection of different categories of tactics. And the idea, so some of these tactics can be mechanical, chemical, cultural, biological, prevention. The idea is that the more overlap of these types of tactics, the better. So all the research that I present should be viewed as a work in progress. Some of it is brand new. Some of it is further along, and some of it has already had considerable impact. But as you know, crop production involves biological and social systems that are both complex and dynamic. So we are often, our target is often moving. Before I get any further, I would like to comment on genetic engineering. That's something we don't often talk about with integrated weed management, but I believe it'll play a larger role going forward. So there are two main types of genetic weed control, direct and indirect. Direct genetic control involves manipulating the pest genome to help manage the weed. And I'll share a couple of examples. One is RNAi. So RNAi involves blocking or manipulating biological processes to limit the expression of target genes. The example here you can think about is blocking a weed's tolerance to an herbicide, so then it's susceptible to that herbicide. The second direct genetic control that I'd like to mention is a gene drive. And a gene drive involves biasing the inheritance of a particular gene or set of genes in wild populations. An example here would be altering the sex ratio of dioecious weed species. For instance, if you could have all the seed that are produced being male seed, over time you get a sense of how that might impact the weed population. So that's direct genetic control, modifying the pest genome itself. The other example, or the other type of genetic control is indirect, and that's where we're actually modifying the crop germplasm to impact the weed. And one example is a plant-incorporated pesticide. This is where the crop is altered so that it produces a pesticide. And I'll give you a specific example a little bit later on that. Another is improving the competitive ability of the crop. This is where the crop is modified so either it tolerates weeds better, or it suppresses weeds better, or ideally both. So I will give you a couple examples for indirect genetic control in the course of my talk. And sorry, if you're interested in direct genetic weed control, I've got nothing for you today, but I'm excited about the future of this aspect of weed management. So before I go any further, why should you even care about integrated weed management in crops? So there's two main reasons. One, weeds have been and continue to be a major threat to the crops that feed and support humanity. Secondly, herbicides are the primary defense against weeds, yet their utility is eroding. So in this graph, you can see the release of herbicides, the solid blue line over time, and it's the most widely used form of pest control, including weed control. There's been rapid adoption and innovation over a 50-year period during the 20th century. And then you see it kind of levels off in the early 90s. Well, herbicide resistance is this solid red line that emerges in the 1970s and is on this upward trajectory. Currently, herbicide resistance is a worldwide problem, and I regret sharing that it appears that the US leads the world in this challenge, and having an exceptional number of herbicide-resistant populations. So at the dawn of the 21st century, multiple herbicide resistance, including metabolic herbicide resistance, has been growing at an alarming rate. However, the herbicide pipeline, the solid blue line, has stagnated with the corresponding adoption of herbicide-resistant crop technology. So what is the future of herbicides and herbicide-resistant weeds? Well, time will tell, but there's several people, including James Westwood and his co-authors, that predict little in the way of new herbicide commercialization in the near future. that dashed blue line that extends to 2050. And this is a function of consolidation of herbicide development within industry, the adoption of herbicide-resistant crops, which employ existing herbicides that are already registered, and just the high cost of bringing new herbicide products to market. Nonetheless, many of us predict a continued rise in herbicide-resistant weeds over the next 30 years, that dashed red line. This is an expected outcome is driven by the reliance on a limited herbicide chemistry and continued evolution of herbicide-resistant weeds. And unfortunately, thanks to climate change, we're headed into a period when weeds are not only harder to control with our conventional tactics, but also may have a greater impact on crop yields. You see, current crop projections, and they're been played out in different greenhouse gas emission scenarios, they all assume a weed-free future. And while I consider myself an optimist, I don't think a world without weeds is realistic. And in the broader scheme of things, probably not even desirable. Recent work by my team has explored some of the relationships among weather variability, herbicide performance, and crop losses using historic data sets from herbicide evaluations conducted over decades of time. And using an assortment of machine learning approaches, we found that the efficacy of important pre-emergence herbicides used in corn are threatened by more variable weather. We also found that crop yield loss due to weeds is exacerbated by high temperatures or low rainfall during corn silking and soybean seed fill. These are exactly the kinds of future conditions expected for much of the Corn Belt, warmer and drier conditions mid to late summer. So the implications of these findings are that herbicide resistance and deteriorating weed control threaten crop adaptation to climate change. Put another way, these predictions of crop losses from global warming, which currently assume a weed-free future, fail to recognize that weeds are actually getting harder to control. So it should be no surprise to you when I say there is a critical need for innovation in and diversification of weed management. We need real innovation, new tactics, and preferably lots of them. We need to act now to add diversity to weed management, diversity in the herbicides we use, how they're used, the crops we plant, and a host of other weed management tools. So the remainder of my talk will focus on ARS's recent and current research on integrated weed management in crops. The focus is on current ARS colleagues, especially those who shared slides with me, which was super helpful for pulling this talk together. So this is as good a time as any to share with you my bias, all right? My own research is driven by a desire to solve problems for those who produce our food. I'm particularly drawn to groups that are underserved in crops that are under-researched. Currently, most of my work is in vegetables, not all of it, but most of it. And the beauty of working with veggies is that the food processors make several important decisions for their contract growers. So in the scheme of things here, my good relations with a handful of processors, if they truly believe in our work, means we can impact nearly all the acreage and in pretty short order, almost immediately. This is in stark contrast to agronomic crops, where I've also done a fair bit of research. There, independent decision-making by growers means affecting change occurs basically farm by farm. This is a subtle but important nuance for measuring the impact of public research. Just appreciate if you keep that in mind as I go through the work that ARS is doing. So let's kick it off here. What kinds of work is ARS doing on integrated weed management in crops? I'd like to first present my colleague, Joanne Chi-Sanford. She is a microbiologist at Urbana, Illinois, in the same unit that I'm in. So over the last 2 decades, Joanne has done some work aimed at understanding the microbiome of important weeds in hopes of finding weaknesses that could be exploited. Here she found water-soluble exudates of weed seeds had different effects on the fungal causative agent of corn anthracnose. So exudates of kochia resulted in this zone of clearing. You can see an image on the far left. Clearly an antagonistic effect on this soil pathogen. Velvet leaf was neutral, whereas exudates of giant ragweed appeared beneficial. Joanne writes, weed seeds and root exudates provide nutritional resources that may influence microbial communities, leading to the formation of microbial recruitment pools with members that may form interactions mutually beneficial to both weedy plant and microbe. So in more recent research, she's investigated bacterial community assemblages in rhizosphere soils of some of the pigweed species. The rhizosphere compartments include the bulk fraction that's loosely associated with roots, the rhizosphere fraction that is more tightly bound, and then the rhizoplane, which actually requires sonication to dislodge the organisms. She has evidence that weed species specific microbial communities form following recruitment from the background soil microbial pool. So she's working to see if this is true of 6 other candidate weed species. And again here, the aim is to develop fundamental knowledge of weed microbiome interactions that eventually can be used, hopefully, to develop some novel weed management practices. Scott Bearson is a molecular biologist in Oxford, Mississippi. Now, you probably recall that I talked about indirect genetic weed control just moments ago, and one of those was plant-incorporated pesticides. So here's a concrete example. Plant-incorporated pesticides, known as PIPs, are biopesticides produced by plants used via genetic modification. They have been extremely successful in insect management. You can think of BT toxin-producing crops. So far, there are no PIPs for weed management, at least yet. So engineered production of naturally occurring bioactives, such as allelochemicals, could result in a novel weed management tactic. Now, you'll hear more about alternative chemistries from Scott on May 17th. So I hope I'm not stealing his thunder here, but I really want to raise this in my talk. His group's work on understanding of sorgoleone biosynthesis is advanced. Sorgoleone is a potent allelochemical secreted by sorghum roots, and it's effective at inhibiting a number of different weed species. This work may lead to the engineering of sorgoleone secreting crop roots, which can suppress neighboring weeds. It'd be a nice, beautiful example of indirect genetic weed control. So his group discovered the entire biosynthetic pathway of sorgoleone. What I find very clever is that they named one of the genes ARS1. Now, Scott tells me that is merely coincidental, and I have every reason to believe him. He says it stands for alkyl resorcinol synthase. Nonetheless, in my mind, that is great science with just a touch of class. Okay, moving on. Ali Wright is a brand new research agronomist in Houma, Louisiana, where she just began working on sugarcane. Now, one of the challenges facing sugarcane growers is that there's a limited number of herbicides registered for use in the crop. It's a problem we commonly see with specialty crops. The worst weeds in sugarcane are grasses, including itchgrass, Bermuda grass, and Johnson grass. So sugarcane, with its crop cycle, may be amenable to the use of living mulches for weed control. Ali writes that sugarcane is typically planted in August, with canopy closure the following June, and then the first harvest in November. So it's basically 15 months from planting to that first harvest. And then sugarcane is grown for an additional 3 years as a ratoon crop. So these crop rows are spaced 6 to 8 feet apart, and very wide furrows that encourage weed growth, particularly from harvest to that following canopy closure, which is a very large amount of time. So a trial being planted this August will examine the effects of a living mulch on sugarcane yield and weed suppression compared to traditional practices growers are using today. So Dr. Hannah Penn, a research entomologist with ARS, will be investigating how the presence of living mulch affects insect populations, including pests and predators. Another area that Ali and Hannah are working on is edge of the field management sugarcane. Effectively managing field edges not only reduces weed seed dispersal into the field, but also may affect insect populations. So they will investigate different methods of managing field edges and how that management affects both weed and insect populations in the field. They're starting a pilot study to compare unmanaged field edges managed conventionally with herbicides, and then field edges replanted with a mixture of native plants. Throughout the next 3 years, they'll be measuring pest populations, predators of those pests, and weed seeds, as well as pollinators. They'll be sequencing DNA of both plants and insects, including gut content analysis, to have a more accurate picture of plant-insect interactions. Andrew Price is a plant physiologist at Auburn, Alabama, and he's been working on conservation tillage and high residue cover cropping systems in the Southeast. He's found that a high residue cereal rye cover crop delays the critical period for weed control in cotton. He's developing a system that integrates high residue cereal rye with polyethylene mulch in watermelon with notable success. Most recently, he's developing a precision planted system of high residue cover crop mixtures, where banding of various cover crop species in the crop row is managed differently than in the inter-row area. So several stakeholders, invitations, farmer adoption, and a major push by NRCS to adopt high residue systems reflects the interest in and impact of Andrew's work. Now, in case you didn't know, edamame, or vegetable soybean, is a special type of soybean developed and grown for consumption at the full seed stage. The picture you can see here on the right. So 10 years ago, nearly all the edamame available to consumers in the US was imported product. Several food processors that I've been working with wanted to grow it here, but cited weeds as a major hurdle to domestic production. At the time, they had a single herbicide registered for use in the crop. It was a generic version of clethodim. So in partnership with the IR4 project, several universities, and some of the herbicide companies, my lab conducted research that ultimately facilitated the registration of 9 herbicides from 8 different sites of action for use on edamame. We also developed several non-chemical tactics for use in integrated weed management, including exploiting crop seed size for competitiveness with weeds, and a very effective early terminated rye cover crop system. Because of the paucity of literature on this crop, which is common with some of our specialty crops, we also conducted some bread and butter research on agronomic practices. For instance, we did research that identified the economically optimum seeding rates for machine harvested edamame. Our results stood in stark contrast to the excessively high and costly recommendations coming from the seed industry. To date, I've been invited to a dozen times to share our research directly with the seed and food processing industries, including internationally. We've published about a dozen journal articles, and we've removed some of the obstacles to development of a competitive, sustainable US edamame industry. Now, there's one more thing I want to be sure you're aware of with edamame. You absolutely must know if you know nothing else. This photo of Gavin and Gage, 2 of my sons, are when they were younger and they were helping me at the agronomy day at the University of Illinois, where we were talking about this work to a bunch of grain farmers. So their instructions resonate to this day, okay? Eat the seeds, not the pods, all right? Got it? It'll be on the exam, so know that for sure. I would like to share a new effort in veg crops that my group is leading. I've assembled a team of weed scientists throughout the US who have stakeholders that are involved in the production of snap beans and lima beans. These are popular vegetable crops that have few herbicides to manage weeds, where weeds not only interfere with crop growth, but they can also contaminate harvested product. And here's an example of how water hemp stems can break at harvest and resemble snap bean. The cost of separating these in the processing plant can actually exceed the value of the packed product, and that is a problem. So my team and I are working with food processors, and we're surveying growers' fields throughout the US, these major production areas, to characterize the weed community, collecting field records, and we will be exploring some of the linkages amongst weed control, crop management, and environmental variables. And my lab is also using a genotyped snap bean diversity panel of 375 entries that represents most of the snap bean improvement over the last century to investigate novel opportunities for integrated weed management. Stay tuned to hear progress of this work at a future meeting. So altering the crop to be more competitive with weeds is an example of indirect genetic weed control. And I'd like to talk about work we've done to exploit crop competitiveness in sweet corn. I've had several colleagues inside ARS, such as Rick Boydston, and outside of ARS that have been involved. And much of the field research was conducted in the Midwest and the Pacific Northwest, some of it also in Ontario, Canada, collectively where nearly all of processing sweet corn is grown in North America. So we found some really robust relationships for hybrid competitiveness across these very diverse environments. We also found large differences in competitiveness among commercially available cultivars. I like to point out that this competitiveness is real. It influences herbicide performance, where less competitive cultivars are at greater risk of herbicide failure than more competitive cultivars. We also found relationships between crop health and weed fitness. For instance, corn lines susceptible to maize dwarf mosaic virus, the most prevalent disease of sweet corn, are less suppressive of wild prosumil, one of the most troublesome weeds of sweet corn. So the sweet corn industry has taken interest in research. Some seed companies have went so far as to market some of their sweet corn hybrids as enhanced weed competitiveness. And this body of work resulted in about a dozen national and international invitations, more than a dozen journal articles. It has impacted some other crops throughout North America and Europe. One thing that I felt lacked, though, was the kind of broad interest within the kind of throughout the vegetable seed and food processing industries. I mean, let me be clear, there was interest. It's just like I sense that in a crop-centric industry, weed-centric ideas just don't sell as good as crop-centric ideas. So let me give you an example, some follow-up work. No doubt most of you are familiar with the pattern of US corn grain yields over the last century and a half. You know, beginning in the 1930s, introduction of hybrid corn, gains in field corn yields resulted from both improved genetics and superior management practices. Environmental stress tolerance is considered the physiological trait most strongly linked to genetic improvement, whereby modern hybrids have greater tolerance to a host of biotic stresses, such as competition, and abiotic stresses, such as drought or low fertility. So today's hybrids yield more than their predecessors in unfavorable as well as favorable growing conditions. And they're also growing at higher plant densities. Over the last few decades, plant densities in field corn have increased approximately 1,000 plants per hectare per year. Yeah, here's another way to look at what's happened in field corn. With plants per acre on the x-axis and yield on the y-axis, the optimal plant density has steadily climbed over time, where newer hybrids were optimized at plant densities higher than their predecessors. Higher yields result from higher optimal population densities. So this idea is crowding more plants in the same area has been this path to increasing yields. Since the introduction of hybrid field corn, plant density tolerance has steadily increased in field corn. Can the same be said of sweet corn? Well, my group found the answer is yes, a little bit. We worked with the seed industry for 5 years to assemble an era panel that includes hybrids from the 1930s to the 2010s. We then conducted field research over a 3-year period to identify the extent to which plant density tolerance has changed over the last century. And here what you can see is how plants performed at 79,000 plants per hectare. Now that's a density that definitely exerts some crowding stress. And 9,900 plants per hectare. This is basically individual plants out in the field. We found that yield potential has not changed. In the absence of that crowding stress, when we're at 9,900 plants per hectare, per plant yield, it's just flat, hasn't changed at all. However, under moderate amount of crowding stress, newer hybrids perform better over time. So at about a rate of 0.8 metric ton per hectare per decade. So what does this mean? It means that plant density tolerance has improved in sweet corn. But the follow-up question would be, well, how good is that plant density tolerance in a larger collection of modern hybrids? The answer is it depends on the hybrid. We've also done research on a wide swath of modern hybrids from nearly every seed company that produces sweet corn. And this is a ranking of popular hybrids from the 2010s, from most to least tolerant left to right. And we found plant density tolerance varies widely among today's hybrids. So what does this mean? It suggests that some hybrids need to be planted at above average densities to take full advantage of their genetics. Other hybrids would only suffer by increasing crop densities. We went so far as to conduct transcription analyses, weighted gene correlation network analyses, and validations of gene expression to shed light on what is it that makes a hybrid tolerant to plant density. And for the sake of brevity, I'll just share that we found there are numerous paths to plant density tolerance, as there are numerous paths to being intolerant to plant density. So, do we have evidence that density tolerance is being underexploited in the real world? I'm glad you were thinking that question, because the answer is yes. At a critical point in our research, we observed two distributions of sweet corn plant densities. One distribution, this one on the left here in red, was of plant densities observed in growers' fields from survey work we did throughout the Midwest. The other distribution on the right was of the economically optimal plant densities from our research in multiple environments. And what's key about this is that both these distributions are of the same hybrid, okay? A hybrid that had exceptional density tolerance. And what we see is there's no overlap between these two distributions. Compared to our research findings on the right, processors were having growers underplant this density tolerant hybrid on the left. So basically, they were aiming for the performance of the average hybrid. However, neither yield nor profit was being optimized in hybrids with superior tolerance to crowding stress. As I said earlier, in my line of work, the food processors make important decisions for their contract growers, including the hybrid that's being grown and the seeding rate that they use. So at this point in our research on this topic, most of our field trials had been conducted in central Illinois. The industry challenged us to identify economically optimum plant densities of plant density tolerant sweet corn in more locations. So we conducted on-farm trials throughout the major production areas of the Midwest. This just shows you our locations in Illinois, Minnesota, and Wisconsin. I'm going to skip all the details of this rather large undertaking, other than to say that we did wear out several sets of truck tires, but here's the take-home point. 1, processors need to select plant density tolerant hybrids. 2, density of those hybrids needs to be increased, and we found anywhere from 10,000 to 18,000 kernels per hectare on average. 3, even without the grower changing anything else, just growing as they currently are, growers could increase their yields 1 to 1.4 metric ton per hectare on average. And this directly benefited the processor by several $100s per hectare. So you're probably thinking, wait, this is a weeds talk, right? What's the benefit to weed management? Well, while plant density tolerance is intraspecific, crop versus crop, we've also done extensive work on interspecific competition in sweet corn, crop versus weed, and the two are linked. Density tolerance and general stress tolerance is advantageous when the crop is coming with weeds. In terms of influencing the seed and food processing industries, this work on plant density tolerance has gone well beyond our efforts that were narrowly focused on proving just weed management alone. Today, contract growers want to use plant density tolerant hybrids. Because of the large economic benefit to the processor, food processors are experimenting with higher seeding rates of known density tolerant lines. There has been some upheaval in the seed industry. Major hybrids from the single company that dominated the market share a few years ago actually lacked density tolerance. But now most, if not all, seed companies are working towards improving plant density tolerance in their new releases. In another work I haven't even discussed, seed companies are quantifying plant density tolerance using an approach proven relevant by our lab. We've had about 15 popular press interviews, published a dozen primary research articles, and I've had the benefit of being able to talk about this around the world. Last count, I think I had 27 invitations, mainly from food processing and seed associations throughout the Midwest, Pacific Northwest, to Quebec, to Australia, and even New Zealand. Another just key point I want to share is that while the US is the leading producer of sweet corn, nearly every country in the world relies on seed from US companies. So technological advances and germplasm improvement that happens here in the US impacts sweet corn production worldwide. Oh, there's my map. I forgot to show advance too, but yeah, it's been fun. Okay, I'm aware that probably most of you are working in agronomic crops. So let's transition and talk more about agronomic crops. And to do that, I'm going to talk about Stephen Mirsky, who is a research ecologist at Beltsville, Maryland. So Stephen leads up USDA-ARS funded area-wide pest management project that he initiated in 2015. The project was launched in response to addressing herbicide resistance in agronomic crops. Like me, many of Stephen's collaborators are in academia, and perhaps a few of you are watching today. He's assembled a team of weed scientists throughout the Mid-Atlantic, South Central, and North Central US. And joining this endeavor were two agriculture economists. So one of their initial priorities was to investigate the utility of harvest weed seed control. Pioneering work in Australia by Michael Walsh and others demonstrated the efficacy of several harvest weed seed control tactics in small grains. Stephen and his team saw an opportunity in the US, particularly in soybean production. So the first thing I wanted to do is to quantify weed seed shatter phenology of 22 important annual weeds. They basically want to know how much seed is left on that plant at the time that the harvester goes through the field. Secondly, they wanted to evaluate the potential efficacy of the Harrington seed destructor. The HSD is pulled behind the combine during soybean harvest. And so what happens is that chaff that exits the combine is conveyed into this machine where an impact mill physically damages or destroys weed seed that finds its way through the harvester. Now, HSD, it was state-of-the-art in its day. That unit has been replaced with an impact mill that actually can be now directly integrated into the combine. So there's no need to pull a machine through the field. In any event, their research remains highly relevant. And in my opinion, the fact that the farm equipment industry is advancing this technology is a great indication of the potential for harvest weed seed control. Stephen also established the long-term agricultural research site in Beltsville, Maryland, LTAR. The LTAR is a corn-soybean rotational study that has various integrated weed management treatments, including cover crops, tillage, herbicides, and harvest weed seed control. It's where the group is testing these fully integrated systems over a timeline beyond the normal 2 to 3 years common to crop production research. And Stephen has extensive experience and expertise in utilizing cover crops and agronomic cropping systems. Given the extensive use of herbicides and growing adoption of cover crops, he launched a national cover crop by herbicide interaction study in soybean in 2016. To date, his team has accrued 45 site years of data. So across Steve's entire program, he has brought in grants exceeding $13 million. He's also published extensively in all areas of the research I've talked about, something like 70 papers collectively, just on what I've mentioned today. Stephen's early initiative has grown to a point now where numerous folks in the group now lead up various aspects of the broad effort. Mark Van Gessel and Michael Flessner lead up the extension and outreach effort. Mutu and Stephen lead up the digital weeds effort, which you'll hear more about when Stephen talks in a few weeks. Mutu and Michael Flessner lead up the decision support tools. Lauren Lazaro has led most of the writing for the papers that they published. And collectively, they have become a Center for Integrated Weed Management, branding their effort as GROW, as I mentioned earlier, getting rid of weeds. Their goal remains to solve problems of herbicide-resistant weeds in corn, soybean, and cotton. Here you get to see a list of their co-leaders and collaborators as of last year anyway, spanning across the continental US. The team has enticed the backing of equipment manufacturers such as Redicop, ag chemical companies such as Bayer, and commodity associations such as the United Soybean Board, just to name a few. The main extension and outreach effort is the GROW website, growiwm.org. It's an evolving website being populated as the GROW team expands and information becomes available. The site is visited approximately 37,000 times a year. GROW has produced 42 videos with 26,000 views on YouTube, and GROW's Twitter account reaches up to 7,000 followers per tweet. So they've got a little bit of reach with their work. So what's up next for GROW? They're planning chaff lining experiments, which will be conducted on farm in 13 states, from Washington State to Louisiana, from Montana to Maryland. And their main question is to study how climate and cropping systems interact with integrated weed management strategies that they'll be testing. Stephen also plans to explore delayed cover crop termination with collaborators in 8 locations. And in this work, their goal is to optimize weed suppression and no-till systems by fine-tuning cover crop management practices. All right, and that's all I have. And I thank you for the opportunity to share my work of ARS, my work and my colleagues in ARS. I want to give a special shout out to my group, both past folks and present folks in my group. I hope you find this talk useful. I've got my contact information here if you want to reach out to me individually. For now, I'm happy to take questions that you submit in the Q&A. Thank you so much.
Great, thanks, Marty. That was really informative. Appreciate that. We've got about, on my watch, we've got about 16 minutes, and I see we've got a couple questions in the Q&A, so I'll read those unless, can you see that, Marty, or do you want me to read those to you?
Let me see. Oh, I can bring up the Q&A.
Okay,
Sure.
Go ahead and do that.
Yep. All right. So any sense of the societal acceptance of direct genetic control? It seems like this may be a preferable in comparison to indirect genetic control that is so unpopular with consumers. Yeah, so direct genetic control that involves modifying the pest genome, and there's certainly some discussion. There's certainly a lot of discussion that will have to occur before we see anything going into practice there. There has been some success with well, I should say success, some acceptance, some use in insect pests. But I think it's, my crystal ball is as good as anybody else, but there's going to be a number of partners that are going to have to be involved in those conversations of, are we going to manipulate, introduce particular genes into weedy pest populations?
Yeah, I'll just jump in there real quick. As you alluded to, we're going to have some other speakers in the series that are going to perhaps bring that topic up again. And so there'll be some more discussion, and I would encourage folks to continue joining, because we're going to actually cover that in a couple of weeks. We're going to hear from an individual who's going to talk about that kind of topic. So, but it's really important, and I'm glad that you guys are asking about. So thank you.
Yeah. Stephen, another question was, are these plant density tolerant hybrids tolerant or resistant to a pest? And I Googled it quick because I wasn't sure. That's corn rootworm. And that's a good question. One thing that we've seen in the vegetable industry is that particularly amongst the processors, there's a reluctance to adopt genetically altered traits. And so while it's quite common to have transgenes in corn and soybean, there's continues to be a great reluctance among food processors to embrace any technology like that. So no, so that's kind of where it's at. It's kind of a little bit surprising. I thought when I started working in this crop a while back that was probably a matter of time, but I think it's swinging the other direction. And now a lot of the companies see an opportunity, since they're not utilizing transgenes, why not market it GMO free? It can't hurt, right? Even if, yeah, that's what I've seen mostly as it relates to anything that's transgenic.
Yeah.
So yeah, corn rootworm, no, pretty much every sweet corn hybrid out there is going to be highly susceptible to corn rootworm.
Yeah. So I don't see any questions right now, and I just wanted to touch on a couple of things, Marty, and this is, obviously your expertise here. So integrated weed management, when we talk about that, it means different things to different people. But you work with growers, obviously in Illinois, and I guess I'd be interested to kind of hear your take on, is it becoming, in weed science, we've always kind of promoted that, and when there were available herbicides, it wasn't adopted as much, but as we're seeing more resistance issues, kind of what you talked about to lead off, are we seeing growers kind of moving back in that direction, either by choice or by force? Or what have you seen, in your area with growers adopting the integrated weed management approach?
Yeah, good question, Steve. And I mean, just one observation I've had is that we have some excellent, not just in Illinois, a number of our universities throughout the Midwest, excellent extension weed specialists that do a fabulous job of communicating the challenges of heavy reliance on individual tactics, the benefits of incorporating diversity in weed management, and personally just kind of surprised how and a common voice coming from not individuals but collectively from the land-grant university system and anyone else in government research or that's involved in conveying educating in education, that it's so I guess it's a little bit surprising to me that there hasn't been that we have the situation we're in right now with herbicide resistance. But then when it comes down to if you're focused on economics right then and there, you've got a lot of things going on. I think what I found collectively in my experience working with growers who have crops with fewer tools, such as some of these specialty crops, I find that there's a little bit more awareness of and acceptance of thinking about the types of tactics used. When you don't have a 30 different herbicide combinations you can try out, it limits it. And I think there's just my general, this experience in general that we have some in the specialty crop world, there's a more openness to considering a broader range of ways of managing weeds. That's just very broad general statement. That being said, there's plenty of there's agronomic crop growers that are out there leading the way on diversification of weed management.
Yeah, and I think I agree. I mean, and when we talk about resistance, it's not just herbicides, it's any tactic that you use repeatedly over and over, whether it's mowing, whether it's, we're dealing with biology here. And so these organisms adapt to whatever we throw at them. So this integrated, approach is useful in many cases, but sometimes, like you said, you're limited in what tools you have available. So I would also say organic systems. That is a challenge with weeds and all kinds of things, but they're limited as well. So it really takes this more kind of knowledge of what's happening, to be really on top of it. So are you working with organic growers as well? Do you interact with those folks much?
I try to do research, at least have some research that's relevant no matter what the management philosophy is. Currently, the number of organic acres for processed vegetables, like commercial scale vegetable production, is really limited.
Sure.
So, I mean, most folks, yeah, there's not much acreage, and not much of it is located in the Midwest either. I mean, it's very small. So, I do see there's a couple more questions. Should I move on to questions?
Yeah. Yep. Good idea. Yes.
So I see you mentioned sorghum. One challenge that growers in the tropics are faced with is the fact that it also stimulates germination of weeds like witchweed. Any thoughts? Interesting. Yeah. I'm going to defer on this question. I hope you come back. Do we know what week? We do know what week. I think Scott Bearson is May 17th, I want to say.
Yeah, let me check.
Where he will be addressing that issue of alternative chemistries, and I'm sure including some of his research with sorghum. So sorry, I'm punting on that one, but it'd certainly be a challenge, if you've got a tactic that also increases germination. But again, I guess if I can comment on this, the whole idea with integrated weed management is that we tailor it to the specifics of the pest and the cropping system. And we're not expecting to have one technique that is a big hammer that takes care of, across a broad array of situations, but tailoring things to what's appropriate for the site. So it would sound like a sorghum secreting crop root might not be the best in the field that you're talking about there. Thanks. Interesting though. Also move on to the next one here. Do you think weed adaptability will enable many of the weeds that hold on to their seed until much later in the season to begin to shatter even earlier over time as more growers use the hammer mills, the seed destruction, the harvest weed seed control? And that's a good point. Yeah, and I think that's something that the group working on that is aware of. And again, the idea is to have many little hammers, right, and not become overly reliant on one particular tactic. But there's some very exciting preliminary research showing just how efficacious that can be in part of an integrated weed management system, at least to reduce some of that weed seed going back in. It's certainly a more viable option than hand weeding plants in agronomic crops before the plants go to seed. We just simply don't have, at this time, the labor or the large enough checkbook to pay for that labor to remove seed by hand. So it's just one. I see harvest weed seed control as one important tactic, and if it can be made economical, there's a lot to benefit. There's a lot to gain from including that. Going to move on to the next. Steve, let me know if you have any thoughts. Do you want to chime in on anything?
You're good. You're good. Okay. Yep. Keep going.
Okay. Would like to get to a question here. Tillage has been a dirty word for. Oh, sorry, popping in my window shift. Tillage has been a dirty word for many for a long time, but should we be investigating how to reintroduce occasional tillage and no-till cropping systems to improve weed control and minimize the negative effects on soil quality? Yeah, that's a good question. Sorry, Drew, I see, Dr. Lyon is located out there in the Palouse in eastern Washington, where, soil erosion, a lot of the fantastic soils in central Washington are coming from eastern Washington, just over a long landscape process there. So in sites where soil erosion could be a major problem, Yeah, that's a challenge. And the nice thing, I guess one thing to consider is that some of the advancements in tillage equipment now, compared to what we had, say, when I grew up on the farm in the sticks of Missouri, it's different equipment now. It can leave quite a bit of residue on the soil surface, and that's an interesting idea. To what extent can we, is there advantages, a net advantage to incorporating some type of tillage on occasion? It's quite possible.
Yeah, it's almost like precision tillage. We're into this precision management, and is there a role for that, or what does that look like? I think you're right, Marty, with the equipment now. That's evolving as well, and I think what Drew is saying is I think there's potential for that. I don't know what it looks like exactly, but I think there's potential for it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So do we have time for one more question?
Yeah, we've got, yep, go ahead.
Okay. I see a question here. Has there been a hypothetical threshold or decade calculated for herbicide resistance and climate change temperature expectancies of 1.5 degrees C increase? I have not, let me make sure I understand this. Has there been a hypothetical threshold calculated for herbicide resistance and climate change? Not sure if I fully understand that question.
Yeah, I don't know if that's looking out into the future or currently.
Yeah. Yeah, Shannon, if feel free to drop me an email. I'd like to discuss that with you. I'm not sure if I follow completely.
Yeah.
So
we've got time for one more, Marty, if you want to. I think we've got
okay.
And then we'll have to wrap it up here.
Okay, let's do the next one. Thanks for the presentation. Well, you're welcome. Yep. Given the timelines involved, population simulations can be helpful for assessing the effectiveness of different strategies, mixes, rotations, etc. Are you aware of any good publicly available simulations of spatial dynamics of weed populations subjected to these factors? Oh, excellent question. Spatial dynamics of weed populations, publicly available. So I know there's been a fair bit of work on spatial dynamics of weed populations. There was a big, well, back in the 90s, there were a lot of folks working on spatial dynamics of weeds. Dr. Dilley was one of the lead scientists on that. And this was at a time where it wasn't standard that data were published with the journal articles, which most of the journals are moving to now. So I am unaware. I know that it exists, but how much of that's publicly available, I've been outside that realm for a little bit. But I would suggest reaching out to Dr. Anita Dilley at Kansas State University, and she may be aware of data sets like that.
Yeah, and that's a good reminder, Marty. So for those of you who do have questions and you want to reach out to Marty, feel free to do that. But also you can contact me as well, and I can put you in touch with folks that I know that could help answer these questions. But I think that's all we have time for today. So thanks again, Marty. This has really been informative, really great presentation. I just want to remind folks, next week, same time, same place, we're going to move to non-crop systems and hear about advancements in weed biocontrol tools. So make sure you tune in for that and tell your colleagues as well. So thanks again, everyone. Have a great rest of your day and a great week.
Thank you.